All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back to Storytime with Uncle Levi. I'm Uncle Levi. I am going to continue on here in Chapter 7 of The Horse and His Boy. Joining us today is, of course, Ramu the Tiger. Ramu the Tiger, say hi to everybody. Okay, thank you, Ramu. Well, Ramu wanted to stare into the camera with his piercing, malevolent eyes and look at you all, as all cats do, as objects to be hunted. But don't worry, he's on the side of the camera. I'll take care of him. So we're going to continue on here now in Chapter 7, Erebus in Tashban. What had really happened was this. When Erebus saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians and found herself alone with two horses who, very wisely, wouldn't say a word, she never lost her head even for a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both the horses, and though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again. But before she could take a step, another crier, "Bother all these people," thought Erebus, was heard shouting out, "Hooray! Hooray! Hooray! Hooray for the Tarquina la Saraline!" And immediately following the crier came 4 armed slaves and then 4 bearers carrying a litter. And here litter means to have like a movable bed, like a hammock that a very wealthy person would sit in, carried by 4 people so that she could be carried in this movable, usually shaded sort of a movable bed or hammock. So again, the 4 bearers carried a litter, which was all aflutter with silken curtains, and all a jingle with silver bells, and which scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Erebus made her first mistake. She knew La Saraline quite well, almost as if they had been at school together, because they had often stayed in the same houses and been to the same parties. And Erebus couldn't help looking up to see what Saraline looked like now that she was married, and a very great person indeed. It was fatal, for the eyes of the 2 girls met, and immediately La Saraline sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Erebus! What on earth are you doing here? Your father..." There was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Erebus let go the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside La Saraline, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up! Do you hear? Shut up! You must hide me. Tell your people." "But darling," said La Saraline in the same voice. She didn't in the least mind making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. "Do what I tell you or I'll never speak to you again," whispered Erebus. "Please, please be quick, lass. It's frightfully important. Tell your people to bring these 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains of the litter and get away somewhere where I can't be found. And do, hurry." "All right, darling," said La Saraline in her lazy voice. "Here, 2 of you take the Tarquina's horses." This was what she said to the slaves. "And now, home. I say, darling, do you think we really want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean to say..." But Erebus had already drawn the curtains, enclosing La Saraline and herself in a rich and scented, but rather stuffy kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," she said. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "My dear, perfectly thrilling," said La Saraline. So let's see what they're doing here. So here they are. You can see the litter carried by 4 slaves. See the litter, it looks like a hammock, but with sort of a curtain roof to it, right? So they're making quite a scene as they walk through town. "I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my new dress. Do you mind? Ah, that's better. It is a new one. Do you like it? I got it at..." "Oh, lass, do be serious," said Erebus. "Where is my father?" "Didn't you know?" said La Saraline. "He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking about you everywhere. And to think of me and you being here together, and he's not knowing anything about it. Oh, it's the funniest thing I ever heard." And she went off into terrible giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, and now, as Erebus had remembered. "It isn't funny at all," she said. "It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me?" No difficulty at all, dear girl, said Lasaraline. I'll take you home. My husband... I'll take you home. My husband's away, and no one will see you. Ah, phew, it's not much fun with the curtains drawn. I want to see people. There is no point in having a new dress on if no one's going to go about. Shut up like this. I hope no one heard you when you shouted out to me like that, said Erebus. No, of course, darling, said Lasaraline absent-mindedly. But you haven't even told me yet what you think of the dress. Another thing, said Erebus. You must tell your people to treat those two horses very respectfully. That's part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Lasaraline. How exciting! Oh, and oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashpan at present. They say Prince Rabadash is madly in love with her. In fact, there have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things all this last fortnight. A fortnight is 2 weeks. I can't see that she's so very pretty myself. But some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out on a river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my... How shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor dressed like a beggar's brat in your house? It might so easily get around to my father. Now, don't keep fussing, that's a dear, said Lasaraline. We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are. The bearers had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Erebus found that she was in a courtyard garden very like the one that Shasta had been taken into a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Lasaraline would have gone indoors at once, but Erebus reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Lasaraline. Here, all of you, and you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of the house today, and anyone I catch talking about this young lady will be first beaten to death and then burned alive, and after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There! Although Lasaraline had said she was dying to hear Erebus' story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than at listening. She insisted on Erebus having a long and luxurious bath, and Calormene baths are famous, and then dressing her up in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Erebus mad. She remembered now that Lasaraline had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Erebus had always been more interested in bows and arrows, in horses and dogs, and swimming. You will guess that each thought the other quite silly. But when at last they were both seated after a meal, it was chiefly of the whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort. In a beautiful pillared room, which Erebus would have liked much better if Lasaraline's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about it all the time. Lasaraline at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Erebus had finished telling her story, Lasaraline said, But darling, why don't you marry a Hoshta Tarkan? Everyone's crazy about him. Oh, my husband says he's beginning to be one of the greatest men in Calormen. He has just been made Grand Vizier. Now old Akshartha has died. Didn't you know? I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him, said Erebus. But, darling, only think. 3 palaces. One of them, that beautiful one down at the lake at Ilkeen. Positively, ropes of pearls, I'm told. Baths of donkey's milk. And you'll see such a lot of me. He can keep his pearls and his palaces as far as I am concerned, said Erebus. So let's look. They're now sitting together in the luxurious palace that Lasaraline has, because she's very, very wealthy, and her husband being royalty means that she has no cares at all in the world. You always were a queer girl, Erebus, said Lasaraline. What more do you want? Now it's important here, this word, queer, Q-U-E-E-R, in all literature at all times, until very recently, it just means strange. It means somebody has very different ideas about things. That's all it means. It's a very normal word. In the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out of the north gate, or then on to the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river, and Lasaraline had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Aravis herself. She suggested that she be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn, but Lasaraline told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going through the gate would be certain to lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Aravis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Lasaraline clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea! There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrak's garden, may he live forever, is running right down to the water, and there is a little water door. Only for the palace people, of course, but then you know, dear." Here she tittered a little. "We almost are palace people. I say it is lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisrak, may he live forever, is so kind. We're asked to the palace almost every day, and it is like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rabadash. I might run in and see any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside it." Now, punt, P-U-N-T, is a type of small water boat. "And even if we were caught, all would be lost," said Aravis. "Oh, darling, don't get excited," said Lasaraline. "I was going to say even if we were caught, everyone would only say that it was one of my mad jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. Only the other day, do listen, dear. This is frightfully funny. I meant all would be lost for me," said Aravis a little sharply. Yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can't you think of any better plan?" Aravis couldn't, and answered, "No, we'll have to risk it. When can we start?" "Oh, not tonight," said Lasaraline. "Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes, and the whole place will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It would have to be tomorrow night." This was bad news for Aravis, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Lasaraline went out to the banquet, for Aravis was very tired of her gigglings and her talk about dresses and parties and weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Lasaraline wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept on telling Aravis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. "And with a peasant boy, too," said Lasaraline. "Darling, think of it. It's not nice." Aravis had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Lasaraline's silliness by now that, for the first time, she began to think that traveling with Shasta was really rather more fun than fashionable life at Tashban. So she only replied, "You forget that I'll be nobody just like him when we get to Narnia, and anyway, I promised." "And to think," said Lasaraline, almost crying, "that if only you had sense, you could be the wife of a Grand Vizier." Aravis went away to have a private word with the horses. "You must go with a groom a little before sunset down to the tombs," she said. "No more any of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again. But there'll have to be food in Hwin saddlebags and a full water skin behind yours, Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge."
"And then Narnia and the north?"
whispered Bree.
"But what if Shasta is not at the tombs?"
"Wait for him, of course," said Aravis. "I hope you've been quite comfortable."
"Never been sabled better in my life,"
said Bree.
But if that husband of that tittering Tarkeen friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, well, then I think the head groom is cheating him.
Aravis and Lasaraline had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Aravis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house and wore a veil over her face. They had agreed that if any questions were asked, Lasaraline would pretend that Aravis was a slave she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here, there were, of course, soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Lasaraline quite well and called his attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers, slaves, and others were still moving about here, but this only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then into the hall of statues, and down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side of that they came to the old palace. It already had grown dark, and they now found themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets to the walls. Lasaraline halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. "Go on, do go on," whispered Aravis, whose heart was beating terribly, and who still felt that her father might run into them at any moment. "I'm just wondering," said Lasaraline. "I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's the left. Yes, I'm almost sure it's the left. Oh, what fun this is!" They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lighted at all and which soon began going down steps. "It's all right," said Lasaraline. "I'm sure we're all right now. I remember these steps." But at that moment, a moving light appeared ahead. A second later, there appeared from round a distant corner the dark shapes of two men walking backward and carrying tall candles. And, of course, it is only before royalties that people walk backward. Aravis felt Lasaraline grip her arm, that sort of sudden grip which is almost a pinch, and which means that the person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Aravis thought it odd that Lasaraline should be so afraid of the Tisroc, if he were really such a friend of hers, but there was no time to go on thinking. Lasaraline was hurrying back to the top of the steps on tiptoes and groping wildly along the wall. "Here's a door," she whispered. "Quick!" They went in, drew the door softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravis could hear by Lasaraline's breathing that she was terrified. "Tash preserve us," whispered Lasaraline. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered onto a sofa. "Let's lie down behind it," whispered Lasaraline. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the two girls got down. Lasaraline managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravis's face stuck out behind the sofa, so that if anyone came into the room with a light and happened to look in exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravis shoved desperately to try and make Lasaraline give her a little more room. But Lasaraline, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" asked Aravis at last in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Lasaraline. "But my poor nurse." And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard at that moment, the noise of the door opening. And then came light. And because Aravis couldn't get her head any further in behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb, as Aravis rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret councils. Here the word dumb refers to people who can't speak, not about their intellectual ability. They were walking backward and carrying the candles. They took up their stand one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course, it was now harder for anyone to see Aravis once a slave was in front of her and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap by which she immediately knew that he was the Tisroc. The least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat and such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans that Aravis couldn't help thinking that Narnian fashions, at any rate for men, looked nicer. And after him came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. Scimitar, S-C-I-M-I-T-A-R, means a curved sword used in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. After him came a tall young man. We already read that part. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little humpbacked, wizened old man in whom she recognized with a shudder the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ahushta Tarkan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment. The young man took his place standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face flat on the carpet, like this, so you can see the top of his head. All right, we finished chapter 7 of The Horse and His Boy. We'll have to come back to chapter 8 soon. So if you're watching this and you've come home from school, or maybe you're getting ready for bed, go to your mom and dad and just give them a great big hug and tell them that I love you. If you're living with grandparents or an auntie or uncle, do the same. Tell them you love them and tell them that you thank them for all that they do for you. All right? One interesting thing here, this Tisroc, he's just like a great king, but he's worshipped like a god. This is common in earlier cultures and is actually still common today in some nations, is to pretend that something other than the great true God of the universe who created all things, to pretend anything other than that true God is a god. So that's why everybody stops and says, "May he live forever," whenever they say his name. So that's what you're hearing. Of course, we know better, right? He's not a god. He's just a big fat man who looks very silly. All right, well, Ramu, say goodnight to everybody. No, you can't get into the camera. You can't, if you just jump like that, you can't get in there, silly. No, you Ramu, just say goodnight. Okay, good night, everybody.